You'd never expect a luxury car to show up at the edge of a Louisiana swamp. But there it was, an obsidian black Mercedes-Benz, crawling down a rutted dirt road like a predator on the prowl. The engine hummed like a lullaby for the damned. Inside the trunk, a wicker basket. Inside the basket, 3 newborn babies, swaddled in red, crying like their souls already knew they'd been forsaken. He didn't look back. The man stepped out, the fine fabric of his Italian suit absurdly clean against the mud-caked world around him. His shoes, handmade leather, sank slightly into the wet earth as he walked to the water's edge. The swamp breathed an acrid, decaying stench, but he wasn't fazed. He stood there in silence for several long seconds, then crouched and gave the basket a single decisive push. It floated off like a death sentence. What kind of monster abandons 3 defenseless infants in alligator-infested waters? The kind who believes perfection is worth killing for. Just off the property line of a nearby animal sanctuary, a retired police dog named Titan sat alert on a wooden porch. The sun hadn't yet risen, but Titan was already wide awake. Something in the wind was wrong. He wasn't your average dog. A 10-year-old German shepherd with battle scars and a reputation for sniffing out bodies in the thickest woods and darkest crawl spaces, Titan had once served with K-9 Unit Bravo in Baton Rouge. After 8 years of service, he'd been adopted by Joe and Ann Mercer, an older couple who spent their retirement rescuing abandoned animals. Titan's ears perked up. The sound was faint, distant, but undeniable, an infant crying. No, 3 of them. He stood instantly, tense, tail rigid, eyes scanning the trees. The swamp wasn't exactly a nursery. Crying babies didn't belong out there, and Titan knew it. Meanwhile, the basket drifted deeper into the water. The cries rose, in desperation. Ripples broke the still surface. Something beneath stirred. A pair of yellow eyes emerged. Then another. 5 alligators now circled the basket like ancient predators closing in on a meal. The largest, a beast well over 10 feet long, inched forward through the water, its snout skimming the surface with menacing ease. Inside the basket, 3 tiny bodies squirmed and wailed. One baby flailed his arms, fists clenched like he was ready to fight the world. The second sobbed softly, hiccuping between shallow breaths. The third, smallest and eerily quiet, stared wide-eyed at the sky above, as if trying to memorize it before it was gone forever. Then came the barking. Titan tore through the underbrush like a missile. His legs moved on muscle memory. The trees blurred past. He'd followed the sound through tangled trails and muck that would have stopped any average dog. But Titan wasn't average. His nose guided him to the water's edge, where he froze. There it was, a basket, floating mid-swamp, nearly surrounded. He growled low, calculating. The current was slow, but the alligators were quicker. There was no time to fetch help. This was his mission now. With a deep breath, Titan leapt into the water. Half a mile away, Anne was rinsing out food bowls when she noticed Titan's absence. That in itself wasn't unusual. He often wandered. But today, something gnawed at her. Gut. She grabbed her phone and walked toward the tree line, calling his name. Back at the swamp, the water was up to Titan's chest. His powerful legs fought through mud and roots beneath the surface. The gators were closer now. One hissed, another slapped its tail, agitating the water around the basket. Titan didn't blink. He reached it just as one of the reptiles opened, its massive jaws inches away. With surgical precision, Titan wedged his head beneath the basket and began nudging it toward shore, growling with every push. His eyes never left the nearest gator. He didn't have backup. He didn't need it. The alligators paused. The scent had changed. This wasn't an easy meal anymore. This was a fight. Back at the house, Joe returned from the barn to find Anne pacing. "He's gone," she said, her voice tight. "Titan's gone." And I heard something like, "Babies." "Babies?" Joe raised a weathered brow. "Crying. Out there." They both stood frozen for a beat. Then Joe grabbed his flashlight. If you're the kind of person who believes animals can sense things, humans can't, things like danger, innocence, and evil, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe to Heroes for Animals, where we bring you the most heart-stopping, soul-stirring stories of animal bravery. Titan was nearly at the bank when one of the gators lunged. He didn't flinch. He turned, snarled, and barked. So, loud and fierce, it echoed through the swamp like a battle cry. The gator halted, stunned. That split second was all Titan needed to push the basket onto a thick patch of roots and drag it clear of the water. The babies were safe, wet, shivering, but safe. And Titan stood guard like a lion. Minutes later, Anne and Joe arrived, panting and wide-eyed. What they saw would stay with them for the rest of their lives. 3 infants, barely hours old. A K9 dog, mud-slicked and trembling, with adrenaline. A ring of alligators still lurking in the water's edge, held at bay by one old dog's sheer will. Anne rushed forward. Her hands shook as she gathered the babies in her arms, checking each one like muscle memory from her days as a nurse kicked in. Joe knelt beside Titan. "You did good, boy," he whispered, rubbing behind his ears. Titan didn't move. He simply watched the swamp, ready for round 2 if it came. No one knew where the babies came from. No one knew what kind of man would abandon them like that. Not yet, but Titan didn't need the answers. All he knew was this. Something evil had tried to erase 3 lives from the world that day, and failed. Because he was there. Because he heard them. Because that's what heroes do. The triplets slept soundly that night, bundled in clean towels by the fireplace in Joe and Ann Mercer's living room. The storm had rolled in just after midnight, hammering the windows with sideways rain. Thunder rattled the old house's bones, but inside, it was warm, quiet, safe. Titan lay curled in front of the fireplace, his body still damp, his breathing slow and steady. Every now and then he'd lift his head to check on the babies, then settle back down with a low sigh. Anne sat in her rocking chair, one eye on the thermometer, the other on a makeshift crib made from a dresser drawer lined with flannel. "I named the smallest one Gabriel," she whispered. Joe, sitting on the couch with a warm bottle in hand, glanced over. "Middle one's gotta be Miguel," he said with a nod. "He's got that spark in him. Eyes like he's planning something." "And the last?" she asked. Joe looked down at the quietest baby, the one who hadn't made a sound since they brought him inside. "Raphael," he said after a long moment. "Feels right?" By sunrise, Anne had called in an old favor. Dr. Peterson, a local physician who'd worked with Anne back when she was a trauma nurse, arrived just after 7 a.m., a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't ask many questions, which was one of the reasons they trusted him. "They're dehydrated," he said gently as he examined the babies, "but strong. You got them out of that swamp just in time." Anne nodded but didn't smile. Peterson paused. "Anne, I have to ask, are they yours?" "No," she said, meeting his eyes. "They're not ours. But they're ours now," the doctor said. Nothing more. Word travels fast in small towns, but Joe and Anne had lived in Bayou Oaks long enough to know how to keep things quiet, at least for a while. They avoided stores. Joe drove to the next county over to buy baby formula, diapers, clothes, and supplies using cash. They disconnected the landline. Anne only answered her cell if she recognized the number. Still, the feeling crept in, like moss along the foundation, that this was only temporary. That someone, somewhere, was looking. And they were. 3 days earlier, in a gated mansion outside New Orleans, Richard Vance had stood in front of a wall-sized mirror adjusting his tie, expressionless. He'd paid cash for the private doctor, cash for the documents, and cash for the hospital staff. No questions asked. Everything was handled. No mistakes. But now he had a problem. Helen. She wasn't coping the way he expected. The sedatives hadn't worked. Her grief had cracked something open inside her, and she was starting to ask questions. Too many questions. By day 5, Anne and Joe had adapted to their new reality. Anne woke every 2 hours for feedings, tracked bowel movements with old nursing forms, and spent her days rocking, burping, singing lullabies she hadn't used in decades. Joe chopped firewood, repaired loose floorboards, and checked the locks 3 times a day. And Titan never left the babies. He guarded the front door like a soldier. When anyone came near the house, even a delivery truck passing on the highway, he was up in seconds. Growling. Staring. Anne had never seen him like that. "Do you think he knows?" she asked Joe one morning as they watched Titan pace the porch. "That someone's coming? I think he knows something we don't," Joe replied. They didn't have to wait long for confirmation. That evening, Joe flipped on the kitchen radio while preparing bottles. The station crackled in and out as the announcer spoke. $100,000. Reward is being offered for information about the disappearance of triplet newborns from St. Margaret's Hospital earlier this week. The father, prominent businessman Richard Vance, has stated the children were abducted from the neonatal unit under unknown circumstances. Anne froze, a bottle in one hand, a dish towel in the other. "Joe," she whispered. He turned to her slowly. "Triplets." She nodded, face pale. "It's them." Joe turned off the radio. The house fell into silence, interrupted only by the soft breathing of 3 sleeping babies. That night, they sat in the living room, too shaken to speak for a while. Then Anne said, "What kind of person loses 3 babies and offers money instead of tears?" Joe rubbed his chin. "We need to know more about this Richard Vance." "Not just him," Anne added. "His wife. What if she's being lied to, just like the rest of the world?" The next morning, Joe shaved, put on his cleanest flannel shirt, and headed into town. Anne stayed behind, rocking Raphael with one arm and scanning the driveway every few minutes. She wasn't sure if she was waiting for Joe to return or someone else to arrive. Titan sat by the window, unmoving. Joe's first stop was Mike's barbershop. Mike had been cutting hair in Bayou Oaks for 35 years and knew every secret within 20 miles. "Triplets, huh?" Mike muttered, snipping the air. "Sounds crazy." "Hospital staff say there was no break-in," Joe said. "But they're being tight-lipped." "Wouldn't surprise me," Mike replied. "My cousin works janitorial at St. Margaret's. She said the staff got a gag order real quick. No one's talking. That doesn't happen unless someone high up is pulling strings." "Exactly." Joe paid in cash and walked out. Next, he visited Rosie, the town pharmacist. She was kind, discreet, and more plugged in than most. "You heard of Richard Vance?" Joe asked, casually thumbing a baby teething ring on the counter. Rosie raised an eyebrow. "You mean the perfectionist millionaire with a god complex?" "Sure." Joe leaned in. "What do you mean?" "He's got this thing about bloodline," she whispered. "Used to talk about it at charity dinners. Fired his housekeeper once because she had a birthmark. He called it genetic clutter." Joe felt a cold weight settle in his chest. What if his kids weren't what he expected? Rosie's eyes widened. "You think?" "I don't know," Joe interrupted, "but I need to find out before someone else does." Back at the house, Anne faced her own battle. Gabriel had developed a fever. She tried cool cloths, adjusted his blankets, and whispered gentle songs into his ear. Titan hovered nearby, whining low, pacing. Anne finally caved and called Dr. Peterson. He arrived by dusk, examined Gabriel, and prescribed an infant acetaminophen with a side of hope. "It's nothing critical," he said. "But you're right to worry. These babies, they've been through a lot already." After he left, Anne sat in the rocker. Gabriel tucked into her chest, heart aching with protective fury. Whoever left them in that swamp didn't deserve a second chance. That night, Joe returned home, his face drawn tight. "He's dangerous," he said simply. "Not just cold, obsessed. Rosie said he believes some people aren't meant to exist if they don't meet his standards." Anne nodded slowly. "Then we can't let him find them." She reached into the laundry and unfolded Miguel's red onesie. Inside, sewn into the hem, was a scrap of paper. Joe unfolded it carefully. It was part of a medical report. The words were faded but legible. Non-critical congenital anomaly, benign genetic variant. Joe looked up. He abandoned them because of this? Anne didn't reply. She was already cradling all 3 babies, 1 in each arm. They were safe. For now. But something told her. The worst was yet to come. It started with the sound of gravel crunching under unfamiliar tires. Anne looked up from the kitchen sink, soap still on her hands, and squinted through the lace curtains. 2 men were stepping out of a black sedan, both wearing suits that didn't belong in a rural Louisiana driveway. Not in this heat, not with those sunglasses. Their polished shoes kicked up little clouds of dust as they headed toward the house. Anne's heart sank. "Joe," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. "We've got company." Joe appeared from the barn, hands dirty from fence repairs, eyes narrowing as he spotted the strangers. The taller one introduced himself with a firm handshake. That was all control and no warmth. "Jonas Miller, private investigator. This is my associate, Carl." "We're following up on the missing children case," Miller said. "Working on behalf of the Vance family." Joe nodded slowly, keeping his expression unreadable. "What can we do for you?" "We're canvassing rural properties within a 30-mile radius of the hospital," Miller explained. "Looking for anything unusual, strangers, suspicious vehicles, or babies that might have turned up unexpectedly." Carl gave a tight smile. "You haven't seen or heard anything odd this past week, have you?" Anne's mouth felt dry. Her ears strained for any sound from the back room where the babies were napping. Any little cry could unravel everything. "Nope," Joe answered flatly. "Quiet out here. Just us, the animals, and the trees." Carl's eyes roamed. "Beautiful. Property. Remote. Peaceful." "Mm-hmm," Joe replied. Anne offered a forced smile. "Would y'all like some lemonade?" Miller declined. "We'd like to take a quick look around, if you don't mind." "Of course," Joe said, gesturing. "Ain't much to see." Anne slipped back into the house as casually as she could. The second she stepped inside, she ran to the babies. All 3 were sleeping, thank God. She turned the TV on full volume just in case they started crying. A rerun of a parenting show echoed through the house, complete with fake baby noises. Titan sat at the window, his eyes locked on the men outside. His body was still, but his tail thumped once, slow, deliberate. A warning. Outside, Carl lingered, near the well, inspecting footprints in the mud. "How many people live here?" he asked. "Just me and my wife," Joe replied. "And the truck? Been out lately?" Joe gave a casual shrug. "Couple times a week. Groceries. Hardware store." Miller scribbled notes in a small leather notebook. "If anything comes to mind, anything, at all, here's my card." They left without another word, but everyone knew it wasn't over. "They'll be back," Anne whispered once the car disappeared down the road. "They're not buying our story." Joe exhaled through his nose. "We need a plan." Titan padded up beside them and sat down, ears still alert. He'd sensed the tension, too. Across town, in a gated estate lined with marble floors and glass walls, Helen Vance stared out the window like a ghost behind glass. 2 weeks had passed since Richard told her the triplets died during birth complications. But something inside her wouldn't rest. Not grief. No. Something else. Doubt. At first, she'd been too sedated to think clearly. Her private doctor, hand-picked by Richard, had managed her days with pills and soft reassurances. But now the fog was lifting, and everything felt wrong. There was no funeral, no body, no certificate, no clear story. And every time she asked a question, Richard gave her the same answer: "You need to move on." That afternoon, while Richard was away at a board meeting, Helen did something she'd never dared before. She opened the door to his private study. A key had been left in the lock, unusual for Richard. Maybe he thought she was still too broken to snoop. But Helen moved with quiet purpose, driven by something stronger than fear. She found the folder in a drawer marked Family Project. Inside were genetic reports, hospital records, highlighted notes with words like mutation, undesirable, and lineage threat. One margin note read simply, solution required. Helen's hands shook. She dug deeper. Receipts for wildlife research, a map of the bayou, a purchase order for a wicker basket. She staggered backward as the room tilted around her. Her children hadn't died. They'd been discarded. Helen left the house the next morning before sunrise. She told Richard she was visiting her sister in Baton Rouge. He didn't argue. That told her everything she needed to know. She drove straight to the bayou. It was vast, wild. She had no plan, just desperation. She stopped at every farmhouse, every roadside diner, asking carefully, too carefully, about anything strange. Abandoned children, lost dogs, noise in the swamp. Most shook their heads, until she saw him, a white German shepherd with intelligent eyes standing alone in a fenced yard off a winding road. He was watching her. He didn't bark, didn't flinch, just stared. Helen stopped the car and stepped out slowly. "Hey there, buddy," she whispered, approaching the fence. Titan wagged his tail once. Then again, a slow, deliberate motion, not excitement, something more like recognition. Anne had seen the car pull in. At first, she'd frozen. Then she noticed the woman step out and gently reach over the fence to pet Titan. She wasn't dressed like a local, too polished, too soft. And yet, her face, there was pain there. The kind of pain Anne knew well. "Can I help you?" Anne called, stepping onto the porch. The woman turned, startled but not hostile. "I'm sorry to bother you. I don't really know what I'm looking for." Anne didn't reply. "I lost my children," the woman continued, her voice cracking. "My husband said they died at birth, but I don't believe him. I found things, papers. He lied, and now I think he left them out here. Somewhere." Anne's heart clenched. "How many children?" she asked, barely breathing. "3, the woman whispered. 3 baby boys." Titan stood between them now, tail low, ears twitching. Anne didn't move. Her mind spun. Could this be their mother? She called softly over her shoulder, "Joe." When Joe appeared and saw the woman, he stopped dead in his tracks. It was her. The wife. He remembered her face from the photos shown by the investigators. But this woman wasn't the pristine socialite from the newspapers. She was pale, trembling, broken, but determined. Joe didn't waste time. "Do you know what your husband did?" "Yes," she said quickly, eyes brimming. "I know everything. Now I have proof, please. If you know anything, if you've seen them, please let me see them. I need to know if they're alive." Anne exchanged a long glance with Joe. Then she nodded. They led her inside. When Helen stepped into the room, she didn't cry right away. She stared. 3 tiny boys slept in lined dresser drawers, each wrapped in soft flannel. One of them stirred, opening dark eyes. Then another kicked his foot, rubbing his face against the blanket. The third sucked gently on his hand. Helen knelt beside them. "My babies," she whispered. "My God." Anne placed a hand on her shoulder. "They're safe now," Joe added gently. "But they won't be if your husband finds them." Helen nodded. "He won't." She reached into her purse and handed Joe a flash drive. "I copied everything. The documents, the maps, the orders. He can't deny it now." Titan walked over and lay beside the drawers, his head resting on the floor, eyes locked on Helen. The boys slept on, their soft breathing like music in the quiet. For the first time in weeks, Helen exhaled. Not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time she wasn't alone. Helen didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. She sat in a rocking chair beside the babies, watching their chests rise and fall in rhythmic innocence. Anne had laid out a spare quilt and insisted Helen rest, but how could she? After 2 weeks of not knowing if they were dead or alive, how could she close her eyes now? Joe sat across the room, polishing an old shotgun he hadn't touched in years. Titan slept by the door, but even in sleep, his ears twitched with the slightest sound. "I'm not leaving them again," Helen whispered around 4 a.m., her hand resting on Miguel's belly. Anne nodded. "You won't have to, but you need to be smart. Richard isn't the kind of man to just walk away, not now." "I know," Helen said. "That's why I need to go public. I have the documents, the receipts, the genetic records. I need to tell the truth before he tells another lie." Joe looked up. "And you think the world's going to believe you over him?" Helen didn't flinch. "They won't have to believe me. I've got proof." But even as she said the words, they all felt it. Proof might not be enough, because Richard Vance didn't play fair. By noon, the weather shifted. The sky turned a murky gray, and the wind carried an edge. Titan paced more than usual. Anne noticed it immediately. "He senses something," she said. Helen stood from the table, heart racing. "Do you think they found me?" Joe stepped outside with his binoculars and scanned the road. "Dust," he muttered. 3 cars, coming fast. Anne reached for her phone. "We're calling the sheriff." "Do it now," Joe said. "And tell him it's urgent." Titan growled low from the doorway. Helen backed toward the nursery. "I'm staying with the boys. I won't let him touch them." Joe loaded 2 shells into the shotgun. "He'll have to come through me first." The convoy arrived in a show of power, exactly as Richard intended. A sleek, black Mercedes pulled into the driveway, followed by a Range Rover and an SUV with tinted windows. 5 men stepped out, 3 of them in black suits, 1 in military, boots, and Richard himself, crisp and composed in a tailored gray blazer. He didn't even glance at the field. He looked straight at the house. "Helen," he called out as if he were there to pick up a wayward child. "Let's stop this nonsense and go home." Joe stepped out on the porch, shotgun cradled, face calm. "Private property. Keep moving." Richard smirked. "I don't think you understand the situation." "Oh, I understand just fine," Joe replied. "You're trespassing." Behind him, Titan growled. Helen peeked through the nursery window, heart pounding as she saw her husband, her children's would-be killer, standing on the porch like he belonged there. Anne sat beside her, holding Gabriel, whispering softly to calm him. "Sheriff said they're 10 minutes out," Anne said. "Just hold the line." Outside, Richard's mask of civility was beginning to crack. He motioned to his men. "Search the property." One of them stepped forward, but Titan launched off the porch like a bullet, teeth bared, barking loud and deep. The man stopped in his tracks. "Call him off," Richard barked. Joe just smiled. "He's not mine to call." Then came the sound. Sirens. 3 squad cars tore down the gravel road, kicking up clouds of dust. Red and blue lights bounced off the trees. The sheriff's truck skidded to a stop in front of the gate. Sheriff Thompson stepped out, hand near, his sidearm. He was a barrel-chested man with decades of experience and a healthy suspicion of rich men who thought money meant power. "Mr. Vance," he said, tipping his hat. "I believe we spoke on the phone last week. You told me your children were kidnapped." "Yes," Richard said quickly, "and I have reason to believe they're here, being hidden by this couple, possibly under duress by my unstable wife." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Unstable?" "She's been through trauma," Richard said smoothly. "She's confused. She believes something happened that didn't." Helen appeared at the front door holding Miguel. Behind her, Anne carried Raphael and Gabriel. "These are our children," Helen said clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He left them in a swamp to die." The entire yard fell silent. Richard stepped forward, hand out. "Helen, you're confused." "I'm not," she snapped. "And I have proof. Sheriff, I have documents, receipts, genetic reports, even a map of the bayou marked with coordinates." Thompson looked from Helen to Richard. "I'll need to see those." Joe handed over the flash drive. "We've backed it all up." Richard's face twisted, his voice tightening. "This is absurd. You'd believe this backwoods couple and an unstable woman over me? Titan stepped forward, standing between Richard and the babies. Sheriff Thompson folded his arms. Let's do a little test. He gestured toward the boys. Bring Mr. Vance closer to the children. Helen hesitated but nodded. Anne handed the boys back to her. They stood on the porch together, eyes locked on Richard. As soon as he stepped within 6 feet, the babies started crying. All 3 at once. Titan's growl deepened to a low, threatening rumble. They know, Helen whispered. They remember, Anne added. Even Jonas Miller, the private investigator who'd stood beside Richard silently until now, looked uncomfortable. He cleared his throat. Sheriff, I should tell you something. Mr. Vance hired me 2 weeks before the babies went missing. Paid me to research how fast bodies decay in swamp water. I didn't ask why. Now I wish I had. Richard spun around, eyes wide. You lying. But it was too late. Sheriff Thompson stepped forward and slapped cuffs on his wrists. Richard Vance, you are under arrest for attempted murder, child endangerment, and falsifying medical records. Richard shouted profanities as he was led away, face twisted, suit wrinkled, and image shattered. Back inside, Helen finally sat down, clutching her sons close. They're safe now, she whispered. Joe sat across from her, the shotgun resting against the wall. You did what a real mother does. Helen looked at him with tears in her eyes. No, we all did. Titan laid down at her feet, placing his head gently beside the boys. One by one, they stopped crying. It was over, at least for now. A week later, news of the arrest broke across state lines. Headlines read, "Prominent businessman arrested for attempted murder of his own children." Helen filed for divorce immediately. She made a public statement thanking Joe and Anne, calling them the family my children never knew they needed. She also thanked Titan by name. The sheriff's office awarded the dog a medal for bravery. Helen bought a small home 5 minutes from the Mercers' property. She didn't want to take the boys away from the people who had become their family. Every day she visited. Every day they shared meals, laughter, diaper duty, and peace. And every night, Titan did one final walk of the perimeter before lying, down under the window, as if to say, not on my watch. 1 year later, the Mercer property looked almost like a daycare center disguised as a farmhouse. Colorful toys were scattered across the grass, blankets laid out like picnic mats, a handmade wooden swing Joe had built himself hung from the oak tree out front. And laughter, bright, chaotic, and joyful, filled the air every hour of the day. 3 boys, nearly toddlers now, ruled the yard like tiny kings. Miguel, fearless and curious, was the first to take off running barefoot across the soft lawn. Gabriel, gentle and observant, preferred to sit in the shade and watch the butterflies. Raphael, still the smallest, had the loudest giggle and the fiercest grip when he wrapped his fingers around someone's hand. Titan remained their shadow. He followed them from sandbox to swing set, always close enough to intervene but never too close to get in the way. They tugged his tail, climbed his back, tried to put tiny hats on his head. He accepted all of it with noble patience, even pride. He was their guardian, and somehow, they knew it. Helen had settled into her new home, just down the road. A small white house with a blue door and a porch swing she never had time to sit on. Her days were full: diapers, bottles, nap times, teething, toddler tantrums, and more love than she ever thought her heart could carry. She visited Joe and Anne every day. The boys thought of it as going to the farm, and they lit up at the sight of the familiar fence and front porch. Miguel always ran ahead. Raphael always had to be carried. Gabriel waved to the horses as they passed the field. Anne joked that her retirement plan had turned into full-time grandma duty. Joe, meanwhile, had taken to woodworking like a man half his age. He crafted cribs, toy boxes, and wooden puzzles, shaped like animals. He'd even built a little red wagon the boys took turns riding in. One cool autumn morning, Helen walked into the Mercer's kitchen with a tray of pumpkin muffins and a flannel shirt tied around her waist. The air smelled like cinnamon and old pine wood. You know, she said, placing the muffins down. We should do something for Titan. Anne looked up from the high chair she was wiping down. What do you mean? He's the reason any of this happened, Helen said. If he hadn't heard them, hadn't gone into that swamp. Anne nodded slowly. You're right. Joe came in from the porch, brushing hay off his jeans. You thinking a statue or a holiday? Helen smiled. No, something useful, something permanent. What if we started a program, a rescue network, in his name? Anne's eyes lit up. Like Heroes for Animals, but real life. We could work with shelters, Helen said. Foster injured dogs, retired canines, the ones no one wants. Pair them with families, especially kids. Joe nodded. You'd have to get the town behind it. I think after what happened, Helen said, they will. 2 months later, Titan's Watch became a registered nonprofit. The first fundraiser was held in the school gymnasium. Joe built a custom raffle wheel. Anne made 15 pounds of potato salad. Helen gave a speech holding Gabriel on her hip about second chances, how they weren't just for people. Donations poured in. A local vet offered free checkups for all rescue animals taken in through the program. A pet food company agreed to sponsor food for the first year. A national morning show picked up the story, and within a week they had enough funding to build the first small shelter on the edge of the Mercer property. It had 10 kennels, a grassy yard, and a white picket fence. On the gate hung a wooden sign, Titan's Watch, for the protectors who never gave up. Titan sniffed every inch of the shelter that first day. Then he sat by the sign and watched the sun go down. Meanwhile, Richard Vance was counting his days. Behind bars, he'd been sentenced to 20 years with no parole. The courtroom had been packed the day of his trial. Journalists, activists, and more than a few locals who'd once admired the Vance name. Helen had sat in the front row, flanked by Joe and Anne. She'd held the triplets close the entire time, refusing to let Richard look at them. His defense had tried everything: mental stress, genetic delusion, even denial. But the evidence was airtight. Helen's calm testimony, Joe's journal logs, the forensic report from the swamp, the documents pulled from Richard's office, and the recordings from the private investigator who'd flipped under pressure, all painted a chilling picture. Richard never once apologized. He called the children biological defects during closing arguments. That sealed his fate. The public turned on him completely. His company collapsed. His assets were seized. His name, once etched in hospital wings and university buildings, was stripped from plaques one by one. In contrast, the triplets grew more beloved every day. They became local legends, not for their tragedy, but for their resilience. Teachers fought to reserve them in future class lists. Neighbors dropped off extra toys or baby clothes on the porch. A bakery sent over fresh bread every Saturday, addressed only to the boys. Gabriel took his first steps during a spring picnic. Raphael said his first word, dog, pointing to Titan Miguel, always ahead of the curve, climbed onto Joe's tractor and refused to come down. One rainy afternoon, a woman arrived at the shelter gate, soaked and shivering with a bruised beagle in her arms. Helen opened the gate without a word and guided her inside. Titan followed, watching carefully. The woman explained in broken words that she'd found the dog near a drainage ditch covered in ticks and limping badly. She'd heard of Titan's Watch on the radio and driven 2 hours to bring him here. Helen called the vet. Anne brought towels. Joe heated up soup. They didn't ask questions. That became the model for everything. They didn't ask where you came from, only if you were ready to heal. By the triplets' second birthday, Titan's Watch had expanded into a regional foster network. Families across the county were now fostering and training rescue dogs. Many of the kids had experienced trauma themselves, former foster children, abuse survivors, or children with disabilities. The bond between the kids and the animals was instant, healing even when unspoken. Helen watched it all from the side of the yard one evening, arms crossed over her chest, heart full. The triplets were chasing bubbles in the sunset, laughing so hard they could barely breathe. Anne stood beside her, holding iced tea. They won't remember the swamp, she said softly. Helen nodded. Good. But they'll remember love, and that's what counts. Helen looked down at Titan, who stood beside her, tail wagging slowly, eyes content. They'll always have him, she said. They always will. Later that night, after the boys had gone to bed and the crickets had taken over the night air, Helen sat on the porch swing with Joe and Anne. The stars were thick above them, scattered like fireflies across the dark velvet sky. You know, Joe said, sipping sweet tea, I thought our lives were pretty much set before all this. Anne smiled. We thought we were done. Turns out we were just getting started. Helen laughed. I used to think motherhood was going to be picture perfect. Nurseries with monograms, matching onesies, monthly photo shoots. Now I'm just happy. If no one pees in the dog bowl. They all chuckled. Titan let out a soft sigh from the porch steps. Tomorrow they'd do it all over again. Feedings, walks, playtime, tears, scraped knees, and puppy baths. But tonight was peace. And after all they'd been through, that was more than enough. The late summer sun hung low over Bayou Oaks, casting long golden shadows across the fields. The sky was streaked with pink and lavender, and the cicadas hummed like a lullaby. It was the kind of evening that begged you to slow down, breathe deep, and just be. Miguel had learned how to pedal the tricycle Joe built from scratch, and he was now racing a determined lap around the dirt path near the barn. Gabriel, barefoot and smiling, chased bubbles that Anne blew from the porch. Raphael sat in the grass beside Titan, clapping and laughing every time the big German shepherd gave him a gentle nudge with his nose. Joe watched it all from the shade of the oak tree, a cold lemonade in his hand, heart completely full. He looked over at Anne, who was laughing with Helen near the swing. You ever think this is what it would look like? He asked. Anne smiled. Nope, but it's what I always hoped it would feel like. Titan was showing his age. The white on his muzzle had spread, and he moved a little slower now. His back legs stiffened after long walks, and he preferred to lie in the shade these days rather than chase the boys around the yard, but his eyes were sharp. His spirit? Still as strong as ever. He remained the heart of the family. At night he still did his rounds, checking doors, windows, the barn, the baby monitors. It was in his bones. Duty, protection, love. Helen had joked once, he's more reliable than a home security system. She wasn't wrong. In early September, the local news station visited the farm again to do a follow-up on Titan's watch. What began as a small rescue effort had grown into something much bigger. Over 40 dogs had been fostered, rehabilitated, and adopted out. 4 of them had been trained to work with children with autism. 1 had joined the sheriff's K-9 unit. Another had become a therapy dog in a local hospital. The station interviewed Helen, Joe, and Anne, but the real star of the segment was Titan. The moment the camera turned to him, sitting calmly with all 3 boys hugging him like a furry throne, viewers melted. That night, the story aired across the state. By morning, they had hundreds of emails. A week later, Titan's watch was featured in a national magazine under the headline, "The Dog Who Heard 3 Lives Crying and Changed Everything." One of those emails came from the University Hospital in Baton Rouge. A pediatric research team wanted to study the triplets' resilience, not medically, but emotionally. They were fascinated by how children, even babies, could retain subconscious memories of trauma, and how the presence of a rescue animal seemed to aid in recovery. Helen agreed on the condition that it never felt clinical. They're kids first, she said. They're not test cases, and he's not a mascot, he's family. The team respected her wishes and worked alongside her to craft gentle, non-intrusive observations. They documented something remarkable. Despite the trauma the triplets had faced at birth, their developmental markers were either average or above. Anne called it grace. Joe called it love. Helen gave credit where it was due. It's Titan, she said. He made them feel safe before they even knew what fear was. As the boys approached their 3rd birthday, the family planned a celebration that included the whole town. It was more than a party. It was a homecoming. Kids and dogs played in the yard. Local musicians set up near the barn. Helen grilled burgers. Joe handed out lemonade, and Anne supervised a makeshift splash pad built from a tarp and a sprinkler. The triplets wore matching shirts with cartoon versions of Titan on the front. And the guest of honor? He got his own seat at the head table, complete with a steak cooked to medium rare. As the sun dipped behind the trees and string lights began to glow over the yard, Helen took the mic and stood before the crowd. Her voice cracked as she began. "I thought I lost everything," she said. "But I was wrong, I just didn't know what I had to lose yet." She looked down at her sons who were half asleep in lawn chairs, cheeks sticky with frosting. "I almost missed all of this, and if not for one dog, I would have." She turned to Titan, sitting quietly at the base of the porch. "You saved my children. You saved me. You gave us time and you gave us home." People applauded, some with tears in their eyes. Joe wrapped an arm around Anne's shoulders. "I think he knows," he said softly. "I think he always did," she replied. That night, after the guests had gone and the lanterns had been dimmed, Helen found Titan lying under the old oak tree. The boys were already tucked in bed, their soft breathing echoing through the baby monitor. Joe and Anne were asleep. Even the crickets were quieter now. She knelt beside him, resting a hand on his thick fur. "You did good, old boy," she whispered, "real good." Titan lifted his head slowly, eyes meeting hers. She kissed the top of his head and stayed there with him until the moon climbed high. In the months that followed, Titan began slowing even more. His joints ached, his naps stretched longer. The vet visited regularly, offering supplements and comfort. One morning, Titan didn't come to the door for breakfast. Joe found him curled in the hay near the barn, resting peacefully, his breathing shallow but calm. Anne brought out a blanket. Helen brought the boys to say goodbye. Miguel kissed his forehead. Gabriel laid beside him and whispered something no one could hear. Raphael placed his favorite stuffed toy next to Titan's paw. They knew. Even at 3, they knew. That night, Titan passed quietly in his sleep. They buried him under the oak tree, his favorite spot in the yard, and planted wildflowers around his grave. The boys helped Joe make the wooden marker. It read, "Titan 200X, 202X, he heard the cry. He stayed. He saved." People came from all over to pay their respects. Volunteers, foster families, reporters, and neighbors who'd only heard the story and been changed by it. The boys left flowers every week. Helen sat beside the tree when the nights were hard. Anne made sure his food bowl stayed on the porch for a full month after. And Joe? He kept the front gate open every evening at sundown, just in case Titan's spirit wanted to do his final rounds. Years later, the triplets would grow up strong and kind. Each would carry a part of Titan with them. Miguel became a firefighter, fearless and steady. Gabriel became a therapist for children who had experienced trauma. Raphael? He trained service dogs. But no matter how far they traveled, or how many lives they touched, they all came home every year on the anniversary of the day Titan pulled them from the water. They never forgot. Because heroes never fade. They live on in the lives they save. Thank you for following this powerful story of loyalty, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a dog and the lives he saved. Now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed an animal act in a way that seemed almost human? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Heroes for Animals for more stories that prove just how far love can go.